Why can't I hear? I can hear myself now. Welcome to the show, everybody. Welcome back to the Trimarc Happy Hour. Some yacht rock to get you started on this lovely weekend. Man, it's the weekend right before Wild West Hackin' Fest, too. I am super stoked. My name is Danny Akatsuki, the artist formerly known as Takaki on Twitter, and now I have another account until they catch me on that one, too. I'm joined by Brandon Colley, unceremoniously dumped. We could talk about that later. The cool part, Paul, I don't know if you knew this or not. By the way, welcome to the show, Paul Asadoorian, everybody.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Oh, so excited. Yeah, I got, we were doing a happy hour a couple weeks ago, and we had our guest, Justin from Trusted Sec, and you could see, I have the video, you could see it live of me realizing I was banned from Twitter. It just said you are like on a timeout, like on a permanent timeout or some shit. But anyway, I now have another account that is quite a bit less than what I had before, but that's okay. We persevere here on the show. Brandon is with me, and I would like to have a huge welcome. And I've learned how not to fanboy, because I've actually talked to Paul in real life now. Like, that has tempered a little bit, but I still am a huge admirer of this man, Paul Asadoorian. He is the brainchild, the architect between the enterprise that has become Security Weekly. I started listening to Paul back when it was just paul.com, and I had posted earlier on Twitter about this, that when I just got into the industry, one of my first security gigs ever was this third shift SOC gig in Philly, and I had to drive to a train station and then take the train into was it 30th Street? Yeah, it might have been 30th Street. And the whole way there, I would always listen to paul.com. That's how I got to, and I, hand to God, is I thought the only time and I've told Paul this too, they used to talk about Huawei all the time, like breached and backdoored and this, and it's a mess, it's a dumpster. It was quite a few years later until I realized they were an actual company. I thought they were just like an APT group, the way that I heard Paul and Larry and Jack talk about it.
That's awesome. Well,
yeah,
it's good to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. So by the way, before we get started, we kind of work backwards from here. I'm already, given some of your pedigree and all this, but Paul is, and if you looked at the starting screen as we had it coming up here, Paul is a finalist for Security Weekly for a Lifetime Achievement Award, and I'm going to put the link in the chat in just a couple of seconds. How long have you been at this, Paul? Like, how long have you been doing the broadcasting thing?
18 years.
Good God.
Yeah, we started in 2005.
Yeah, so you were in it about, you started it, what made you, so I didn't even get into security until about 5 years after that, so you were well into that. What made you, like, what was around at that time? Because I remember, even when I started listening to paul.com, there was I think there was Southern Fried Security was around, and a couple of other shows. I don't remember a whole lot. Was there a whole lot in the way of shows like yours at that time?
Yeah. Martin McKay had like the Network Security podcast. Of course, there was the Twit One Security Now was big back then, and still going today. So I think they predate us. And a few others came like after we got started. There's been a lot of pod fading, people coming and going kind of thing, but yeah, there wasn't very many. Back then people didn't know what a podcast was. I had to explain it all the time, like even people that worked in tech were like, what's a podcast? Now I feel like we've reached a mainstream media kind of platform with podcasting, which is kind of a double-edged sword. Right now the problem is there's so many podcasts.
So many. There's I've had, like, I think I'm on my fourth by this point, of like, luckily thankfully to Sean Metcalf, he lets us do this thing. When I first started here, I was like, hey, we should really do a podcast. He's like, yeah, do whatever you want to do. I don't actually think Sean listens to the show, because I've yet to...
No, I know he doesn't listen to the show.
Shut up, Bill. nobody else in the chat. This is the other downside, Paul. Like now with like the advent of like Twitch and the I like Twitch because of like the audience interaction, right? But then my audience also tries to screw with me saying, "Oh, we can't hear you," and it's just one dude saying, "Oh, I can't hear you." I know you can hear me, Bill, because Matt hasn't said anything, and like that's the downside. What kind of did you start with like no? When did the feedback start for you when you did your show? Like, did you start doing it and go, somebody might care, somebody might not? Did you see a hole that you were trying to like there's a gap here that we're trying to do, or just like, what the hell, we're gonna do this?
Yeah, I mean, my kind of now infamous story of creating the podcast was I presented every month at a security meetup at the university that I worked for at the time. And so all the different like heads of all the different departments, the technology representatives from all the different schools in the university would attend. And it's interesting, it was kind of similar to some elements of the show today, right? I looked at the security news, what was happening, and I kind of broke it down. I looked at what I was seeing personally on the network, what attacks were happening, and I would cover some of that, and just general security stuff. And then that ended for whatever political reasons, and I was like, it's not my coworker whose nickname's Duck Sauce. I'm like, dude, like I feel like there's a void. He's like, you should do a podcast. I'm like, what's a podcast? And so I bought a first generation Apple iPod from one of my other coworkers used, and I put podcasts on it, and I was like, oh, those are podcasts. I listened to a lot of the Twit stuff. Leo Laporte, I was a big fan from back in the ZDNet days, and whatever show he had like way back in the day. So I started listening, and I was like, oh, yeah, we can do a podcast. And we were going to a SANS event. Ironically enough, the SANS event we were supposed to go to was supposed to be in New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina happened, and so they moved it to Los Angeles. So episode 1 is actually recorded in a restaurant at the top of the hotel we were staying at that spun around. We weren't in the spinny part, but the restaurant was spinning around while we recorded the podcast. So that's how we got to start. And then, to get feedback, Danny, it's an interesting question. I think we had an IRC channel pretty early on. I know people would send us email, and it was IRC, like back in the early days. And we would actually stream. It's funny, I was actually just talking with Larry and some of the other co-hosts about streaming. I'm like, we've been streaming for a really long time. Like, even when we had audio-only stuff, we would put up some kind of streaming thing. Icecast? I think it was Icecast, back in the day, and just give people a URL in the IRC channel. So we had that like back in the day, which was fun. It's great, and we still live stream, today.
What were some of the things that did you go into it with any expectations of like how it was going to go or how you were going to set up? Like, if you could, this is usually a question I would get to later, but I would love to know it now. Of whatever this is, how many years is that? 2005 to now? What is that? Almost 20 years. I'm going to round up because my brain doesn't do that on a Friday. Almost 20 years. What would you go back and tell young Paul and young Larry? By the way, who actually started? Like, who was your original crew on Paul.com?
Oh, so it was myself, Larry, Twitchy, and some of the early members were like the Mason, Joe Conlon. Like, it was a very different. Larry's been with me from the beginning.
Yeah.
Which has been an amazing journey in friendship. Larry and I were just hacking on stuff in the studio last week, so that continues. But those were some of the early people. Twitchy was hilarious. I haven't caught up with him in a few years, but he's awesome.
Who was there was a woman. Was it Allison? Yeah,
Allison.
One of my all-time favorites.
She's awesome.
Yeah, she was one of the.
She lived in Rhode Island, and then she moved somewhere else. So.
Sorry,
she used to come live into the studio and just hang out with us.
Yeah, she was a pretty regular contributor when I was listening, and she was always absolutely one of my favorites. Larry, funny enough, one of my favorite stories. I forget even how it happened. Oh, on one of my old podcasts, we had Ed on SCOTUS, and he came on. It was right around Christmas time, and he was very gracious, and we were just talking about things. And I realized that he lives pretty close to me, like in Jersey, from where I am to where I lived, very close. And I was completely taking the piss. And I said, "Oh man, you should have me over to your house." He goes, "Okay, when do you want to come over?" And I was like,
No,
I was like,
I knew that story. Knowing Ed as well as I do, I knew where that story was going.
and I was like, okay, cool. So then, like, it was like a week after Christmas, and I went to his house, and who else is there but Larry? And they were messing with some like it was either like hue lighting or something, but they were doing a bunch of automation because you've probably seen Ed's office space, right, in his house.
Yeah.
And Larry was there, and like none of my shit was working, so I just got to sit there. This was quite a while ago, so I was still kind of like, I shouldn't be here, but I got to just watch them mess with stuff. I got to see his World War II code machine, the Enigma.
Yeah,
that was a trip.
amazing, right?
And to this day, the best chocolate chip cookie that I ever had was from Ed's wife.
I've heard that his wife makes like the best chocolate chip cookies.
If you have yet to have them, bro,
you're not the first person to tell me this.
it is I've not found any since before, and I doubt I'll find any after that could quite measure up to Ed's wife's chocolate chip cookies. They were absolutely amazing. So when did it become like, hey, so were you still doing like a full-time gig as you were building the show?
Yeah, I did a full-time gig while I was building the show for quite some time. So I worked for a university. Then I worked for like a university consortium for about a year. I was an independent pen tester for a little while. And then I got a job at Tenable Network Security for a while. And then I think in 2015-ish is when I left Tenable to do Security Weekly full-time.
Was that
around the time?
Where were you? Just in like your personal day-to-day where you're sitting there and going, I'm going to do this. Because that must, like, was that scary for you? Like to say, here's the thing that I've built on, and now all of a sudden I'm going to just go make this leap. Like, was there a particular thing that you felt in your gut that said, now is the time to do this, and like, hey, what the hell?
Well, I mean, revenue helps. So that was a big factor, full transparency. I didn't really want to leave Tenable either because I loved working at Tenable. And Ron and Jack and Renaud were just amazing founders and just did an awesome job running the company. So I was by no means unhappy at Tenable. And I had a really cool gig at Tenable that I was testing stuff in the lab and reporting on it. It was awesome. But there was other than revenue, there was a lot of responsibilities and a lot of things happening at Security Weekly that I knew I couldn't manage anymore working full-time somewhere else. So like it wasn't fair to either my day job or Security Weekly at that particular juncture. So I needed to step out. I needed to lead a team, right? So we had production people both on the technical side and the operations side that I had to go lead, right? And I had to do sales, like the whole thing. So
do you remember where you were when you finally like made that? Was it a gradual thing that just kind of started, or did you sit somewhere one day and go, okay?
It was kind of a gradual thing. I definitely talked about it with my wife and said, like, I think now's the time.
Yeah.
I think we had talked about it probably leading up to that as like, someday I might want to go do this full time. Right now it's still kind of a side gig. So, we made it work.
What do you say to, and I'm sure you probably get, this is not an original question, but I want to know it. What do you say? I'm sure you get people that come up to you and say, hey man, listen to you for a long time, listen to the crew for a long time, I want to do a thing. Like how do you see it's different now, like you had talked about earlier, of like now there's just you can't throw a stick without hitting somebody with a microphone and headphones, versus before where there was like not that many out there. Have you gotten people asking you for that advice? And if you do, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I would never discourage people from taking on an initiative like that. I think you got to find your niche, you got to find your audience, and just be consistent, right? Is really, definitely go create a podcast or a live stream or something like that. And, again, like find your niche in your audience, and don't worry about appealing to everyone, appeal to your audience, and develop content that appeals that your audience is going to like. And have at it.
Yeah, that was, by the way, Brandon, I am dominating this, so if you got questions, just jump right in, my friend.
No, this is your show, man. I'll jump in eventually, but
see, and that's the thing. Fun. That's the thing too, Paul, because like you've you've always worked with like that cadre of people, right? Like you didn't start it solo, you did it with people.
Yeah.
Mine's always been. What's it? No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, dude, we started the show. I said this somewhere else, and I don't remember where. It might have been in a keynote as well. And the Lifetime Achievement Award is. I mean, I'm just so honored, and just humbled by it. It's amazing. But we started the show because we wanted to get together and drink and talk about security with our buddies. But the reason was not to get people interested in security. And many people over the years have said, "Hey, I listened to your show, and I got in security because I listened to your show." Right, was one of the driving factors. And I'm like, that's an amazing side effect. I'm like, the original goal was just for us to like drink and talk about security. We had a lot of things that we needed to get off our chest and talk about with each other, and we're like, we might as well make a podcast out of it. And that spirit, still lives, especially in our news discussion on the show every week. So we go long on that segment. I'm like, but we got things to say.
Yeah.
18 years later, and I'm still, you'll hear us say, I'm stepping up on my soapbox, or this really grinds my gears. So it's somewhat therapeutic as well.
Yeah, and that's always been my thing too. Once I was ready to let go of like, worried about like who's gonna see it, what am I saying, like why is it gonna, like I would just go and do a thing. Like when I left that first one and started doing like my own one-off thing, which you mentioned consistency, which I do not have. I did it for a while.
It's hard.
It's super hard, man. I don't think a lot of people don't even realize that, even when you're not playing at the level of a Security Weekly or anything like that. Just coming up with things that like a lot of times I'll just go like I'll have maybe a couple of bullet points like you just said. Oh, this really grinds my gears, and then I'll just kind of go with that. But my niche has always been the involvement with other people. Like I've always said consistently, like I'm just here to put the tent up and make it look nice. And if I could have other people, and yet I love when I have guests, and I love, because everybody has a story, right? Like people love nothing more than talking about themselves. I'm not saying that in a derogatory way whatsoever. People just love, you ask them things and get them speaking, like and everybody's got a story and they've got a different perspective. However, I have never really liked having a podcast crew until I got to do this Trimarc show. This is the first 20 years, whatever it is now, like I'm in my 12th year, whatever, just in the security industry, and probably like my 8th year of doing live shows. I've yet to find anybody I can tolerate besides Brandon.
It's kind of funny. Over the years, a lot of hosts have come and gone, and I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for the hosts on the show. But mostly the host, like there's no, and we get crap for this sometimes because like there's no interview process, there's no real formality. But if you hang out with us, we're hanging out together, like you probably end up like, dude, just come to the podcast, like come hang out, right? And do the show, like be a guest maybe first, and then I'm like, yeah, come back and hang out with us. So that's pretty much how every single host ends up on the show, is we're just hanging out, man, right?
Yeah.
And I want to hang out on the podcast. So
yeah, and it's like not people. I think people put a lot of pressure on themselves to, we always say like we actually just changed terminology here at Trimarc too. Like we initially we first said like, oh, be your best self, and then we were talking amongst the whole company one time. We're like, not like, let's change that to be your authentic self, because like best is a high bar for fucking anybody, but that if you have that like authenticity and you have like, this is who I am, I have a thing to say, it's making me happy to say it, and I have my friends with me, let's just do a thing. And my only hope, my main goal, I don't know if you had like, I mean if you didn't have like a grander goal or scheme, but I imagine, actually let me start here because now I'm getting my parallel tracks running. Do you have like a long-term, like, so my long-term goal with my any content that I make or whatever is that it helps one person, not that it outlives me, not that that like it'll be there when I'm gone. I have a general picture of just one audience member, and as long as I hear one thing or I think I'm helping one person, I will keep doing that. When it gets hard to do these things, as I know it probably does for you, what kept you going? Like, did you ever think, all right, I'm done, or I'm bored, or I suck, or I want to do something else? Did you get to a point where you're like, all right, I don't want to do this anymore, but then you kept going?
Oh yeah, several times.
It's a very long-winded way of getting to that question, but I dug it out.
Several times. Like, is it worth it? You know, the time commitment, the investment, the whole thing. You know, a lot of those things you kind of call into question along your journey, but I can't say there was maybe one thing that kept me going. Probably multiple things. Some of them somewhat selfishly. Certainly, the notoriety that we've gained by doing, you know, the podcast opens up a lot of doors for us, right? So I'll start with the selfish reasons, right? I don't want to stop doing the show because I bring people on to interview and I connect with people, right? And that keeps my network in information security kind of alive and well and breathing. So there's certainly that. Not selfishly, put myself aside for a moment, if it's still helping people, right? Like, one of the other driving factors to keep going was all those people that came up to me, even if it was for 30 seconds, and just say, hey, I love the show, keep doing what you're doing. That keeps us going too, right? Because we're helping people. We're like, hey, I like listening to the show, I learned stuff, and I'm entertained, and that's the goal. So those are probably the two main reasons what kept us going over the past 18 years, even when things got hard, you know.
So where is it now? So you have since divested, and now you have several. Like, I was even on one of, I forget which flavor of Security Weekly it was, but I think with Doug, Dr. Doug. Is he one of your hosts? Yeah. I was on one time like 2-3 years ago, and that was another huge thrill.
And Doug's awesome. Yeah, and Doug, again, like, I don't always remember how people get involved because it's so natural progression, right? So yeah, Doug's one of our hosts, and I mean that all came about when I was able to focus on it full time. I was like, we need a network of shows, right? We can't just have one show. Now I have some time to build a network of shows, and I said we're going to focus on different topics, and that's going to open up more sponsorship slots, essentially, to help fund it, right? Because you create a new show, like, there has to be a business plan around that particular show, so it has to generate revenue, but I'm like, also it has to generate some audience interest as well. And so we decided to break it up in a certain way, which represents the network today, but that was, you know, basically how I decided to grow. It's not all like roses and fields filled with beautiful flowers doing that either.
Sure.
Right? It's super hard to keep the content relevant to that sub-segment of the audience. So, like, we've got Enterprise Security Weekly and Business Security Weekly and Application Security Weekly, and it dilutes some things, right? Because there are some folks that, like, have been doing it as long as I have, and they've kept, like, a smaller subset of shows. They've kept that one show, which keeps all of your audience and all your sponsors around one show. But, like, breaking it up sometimes makes it really hard too for content planning, and then for sponsors as well, because now you got more slots to fill, right? Whereas before, they're like, hey, I want to sponsor Security Weekly. I'm like, great, you're coming on Paul's Security Weekly. It's like the one show, and we're off to the races. You know, now they got to spread across multiple shows. So,
did you get any pushback from sponsors doing that? Like, people who were invested in your original show and now you're spreading it out?
Yeah, not so much pushback. I think a lot of the questions, especially early on, were, well, what's the difference between Enterprise Security Weekly and Business Security Weekly, right? So I'd say the one thing that helped us with that is doing audience surveys. You know, asking your audience, like, hey, what do you like? What don't you like? Which shows do you listen to? And, like, who are you? Like, I don't even want your email. Like, do you work in what industry and what kind of, like, level in security are you? Are you working a SOC? Are you a manager? Are you a CISO? Like, just give me that information anonymously. I don't want any of your personal details. Some people are like, well, the email is optional. I'm like, I don't want their email. That's not why. I just want them to respond to the survey and say, like, I'm Joe whatever, and I work in a financial, and I'm a manager level, and I listen to Enterprise Security Weekly, right? To help build that profile. So we can go back to sponsors and be like, all right, this is like the audience who listens, and this is the programming for that show, and it's different.
Do you feel like that's growing more intentionally like that? Do you feel like you've lost some of the fun that you were talking about when you first started, where it was just a bunch of guys sitting around drinking and smoking cigars. And do you still feel like you have that spirit, that you've been able to maintain the spirit, even though you're being so intentional with your categorization of things?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Brandon. It's hard to recreate that spirit on Paul's Security Weekly on the other shows, because we record Paul's Security Weekly after 5 p.m. and we start drinking. Usually before. Oh, now that we're older, we're trying to, it's not as easy to to consume like we were before. But we start drinking and we create this like really relaxed atmosphere, then the whole thing. The other shows had to be programmed like during the day. I'm like, I can't be every night, getting drunk recording a podcast. Like that doesn't scale. So we had to find ways to keep, those shows fun. Adrian does like the squirrel story of the week. Doug is always just entertaining on the news. Like everyone's kind of got their shtick. Now I started all those shows as the primary host, and I'm like, we need to find someone to primary host. Like I can't do it anymore. So the folks that host the shows now are amazing, and I've handed the baton to them, and they've been off to the races and are doing amazing work. But it is hard to still have fun. The office environment was always fun. Certainly, because everyone worked for me, and I was like, we have a bar in the studio, we should like use it, right? Like it's just a fun place to work because we have to do fun shows. So I tried to build that culture into the company. This is a fun place to work. Like we're gonna go to a conference, we're gonna have fun, and that's just part of the culture. So
Well, that's why we call this the happy hour.
that's it.
Right?
Yeah, I don't have it.
Despite the absolute vitriol that I throw at guests, my guests are always treated very nicely to my co-hosts, that like you would think that you guys even like each other. Did you have any problems mentally, or just like as you started having to hand that stuff over to people, or were you just like gladly like, yes, come, you can host this thing or whatever?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I had to hand the reins over to a lot of folks over the years, and I think that's been one of my philosophies and advice to people, is to get good at that, right? Whether you're in a technical job, whether you're running a company, or anywhere in between, you want to be able to do your job so well that you can train someone else to do it, right? There was someone early on in my career that instilled that wisdom on me, and it stuck with me, thankfully. So I did that both in my career and information security, and when it got time for the company, down to the production team, I had to hand off production. I'm like, you are editing the audio now. Like, this is not me anymore. I have to hand off these tasks to other people. So handing the baton to the host was natural. And I think at that juncture, like, I was kind of done doing the show, right? Like, at a certain time, I was like, I need to do something else. Like, I have my show that I do every week, Paul Security Weekly. But all the other shows, I was kind of like, it was always kind of in the back of my head that I would hand that baton off. Like, I'm going to do this to get it started, get it going. And then I want to find someone else to take it over, because I can't spend that much time hosting shows. When I was running the company, I'm like, I got to do sales, I got to do, technical stuff for my show, and I have to manage the team. So, and also passing the baton, I hired Matt Alderman as our CEO. So I'm like, I can't be CEO and CTO and podcast host and managing production all at the same time. Like, I just can't wear that many hats. And I didn't want to be the business guy. I wanted to be the more technical guy. And so that gave me an opportunity to develop our software. So we developed automation software for publishing podcasts called PPWorks. And we developed like a really cool low budget way to produce multiple shows per week. It was like you could do a show every day and streamline that process. So I borrowed from my background in technology and in Linux and Unix and programming and applied that to the studio. So we don't do anything necessarily different in the studio. How we do it is kind of like with open source software, Python scripts and stuff like that. So the execution's different than most studios.
So I really like what you said about that too. It's where it's more of a mindset going into it, that you know that you're not going to be able to do everything, or that you're wanting to train someone to eventually take over. Because I feel like a lot of times that comes secondary to where you've at the point where you've grown so large that you have to, and then it's hard, right? So if you go into it knowing like, okay, I don't want to do this, or I'm going to stick to what I'm good at, versus being forced to hand that baton over, like Danny had said. I think it's harder to do that once you haven't been willing to do it thus far, right?
Yeah, I ended up being in a lot of business conversations, and I'm like, okay, I can talk business. I went to school for business. I can talk business, but like I'd way rather talk tech, right? And so Matt came on, and Matt has a technology background, but also a business background. So Matt was kind of like the 75% business, 25 tech, and I was like the other way around. So we were like the yin and yang, right? And I was like, I want to go talk business with people so I can focus on tech kind of stuff. So, yeah.
You talk good business speak. I'm gonna go do my monkey brain. Speaking of stuff that's not so you have your show now. Do you still own all of them, or did that get spun? Like,
yeah. So it's a good question, Danny. So in 2020, the Cyber Risk Alliance acquired Security Weekly and all of its assets. So all the shows, all the assets associated with Security Weekly are owned now by the Cyber Risk Alliance. And so all the shows still, go on every week, just under a different parent umbrella.
How did that feel? I know I just asked you about how it felt to kind of give up and allocate to people. What was that like?
That was emotional, certainly at certain junctures. Like I remember the call when the deal was finalized. Like I was kind of emotional. I'm like, hey, you guys own the coolest podcast network out there anymore. And I'm like, crap, I don't own the coolest podcast network anymore. Someone else does. But I think there was, always kind of, part of the progression as well. I still didn't want to focus on the business side, right? And I saw writing on the wall that made it very strategic for us as Security Weekly to be part of a larger company that had more offerings, right? I mean, that was really the driving factor behind it. I'm like, I can't go sell these large enterprise companies like a couple podcasts here and there. I'm like, we're just never going to make it. I'm like, the market's going to be flooded. Turns out I was right about that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there was a 500% increase from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic number of podcasts.
That bad.
And I said, everyone's going to start doing their own podcast. I'm like, technology has evolved now where there's not this proprietary technical wizardry that you need to create a podcast like you did way back in the day. I'm like, now it's mainstream. Anyone can go to a website and sign up for a SaaS account and go create a podcast. So I'm like, companies are going to do their own podcasts. And I'm like, that's going to be, rough for us business-wise. I'm like, also, to appeal to larger companies, I'm like, I want them to have a journey and buy a package. And I couldn't provide everything that I wanted to for them in that package, right? I want them to have brand awareness, lead generation, thought leadership, all in one thing. And for that, like, you need a newsletter, you need a conference to sponsor, you need webinars, you need like all this stuff. And I'm like, we joined a company that has all that, right?
Yeah.
So I'm like, now you can sell them. Like, we're part of this package that should build a journey for this sponsor. And I mean, that was the vision behind being acquired. So I think a lot of my predictions came true. I can't say that happens all the time.
You're like, I told you so.
But I didn't like predict the pandemic, right?
Sure, yeah.
But
no, that was a catalyst. I don't think any of us would have seen coming. But you're right. Like,
I could see, like, it gets hard. It gets hard to do the deals we were doing were getting harder because we didn't have a whole bunch of offerings. And I'm like, I don't know if I want to go build like 3 more companies basically to do this. And the opportunity came where we could just be part of a company that had already either built or bought those other companies. So
and I remember, you're right, like having to do back when it's not that long ago. I mean, if I really started getting into it when my son was born, it's about 8 years ago, because that's where he is now, but he's also 25 in his brain. But just having to be like, realizing that how people consume things differently, which I'm sure you also have to take into account. Of some people my favorite medium is video and it's chat, but I don't personally consume things like that. No. I am much more audiobook and podcast. And there was such a high bar to get those things in, and like there was all these steps. And then when I finally came back to doing it here at Trimarc, and I was like, no, okay, I really want to do like audio and publish it. It's so easy now. Yeah,
Yes.
even for me, like not even like with your Pew Pew Works, I do just on like RSS.com. And it's like, not only can you upload things, but we'll just push it to other things for you. And it's like a one click. And I said, holy shit, no wonder it's exploded like it has.
And it's interesting. If I could have chosen the path that I wanted to go build out a software company around podcast automation. But I love cybersecurity, and I mean, I'm a hacker at heart. I mean, you can probably tell by my background. Like,
we're gonna get to that. I'm getting there.
We fitted well together. Like, and I love the hacking community, the cybersecurity community. So I'm like, I would never leave. I love what I do, and I love the people that I interact with. So I was like, I don't want to go build that, but that software is actually tuned for not so much automating like the destinations, although it does some of that, because I think you can get that in a lot of different places. It's more if you've got more than one podcast and you have sponsors of those podcasts. So what we ended up, there was like this crossroads where we're like, well, all the information about every podcast we produce is in PBWorks, and it's mostly like from the time recording stops onwards is when we were using it. I'm like, but it has all this knowledge even at that point. I'm like, we just need to build like a front end to it so I can go, what shows are we doing and who's sponsoring them and who are the hosts and who are the guests and when will they happen, and track all of that, in the software, and build a lot of automations from the very beginning of when you think about doing a podcast all the way to the end when, after publishing is completed. So that's why PBWorks was so instrumental for us. Oftentimes, if you're just doing one show, like PBWorks is overkill for you.
Right. Now. And even, like I said, they make things so easy. So when you're not doing this, I remember when I first started listening to you, was it Taekwondo that you were doing?
Yeah, I did Kung Fu.
Yeah. Kung Fu. Yeah. Cause I remember, I did Kung Fu too. And I'm like, oh shit, he does it too.
Yeah. And then I ended up having kids. So I have 3 boys.
God,
and
Jesus.
I've
got one.
Dude, and they're all involved with something. So, like, part of my hobby right now is soccer because my 2 younger ones do soccer, and they're amazing at it. And the soccer community here in my town is amazing. And so we spend a lot of time in soccer, even to the point where I'm coaching his rec team soccer. And I knew nothing about soccer. Well, I knew nothing about soccer. I had to, like, go read the rules and, like, observe my son playing hundreds of games and listen to what the coaches were telling him and kind of tucked it back in my brain to when I stepped on this. This is like your classic hacker thing, right? Like, I observed, I listened, I went and I read, and I tried to become an expert like we have to do so many times in cybersecurity. You got to be an expert in that. I stepped on the soccer field and people were like, wait, how did you know that? I thought you never played soccer.
I figured it out.
I didn't. I'm figuring it out. I mean, I'm not the best at the soccer coaching or rules, but I'm hacking my way through it, right?
Yeah, and I've often said that too. Like when you definitely will get the question from somebody somewhere saying, if you weren't doing this, what else would you do? I just, this is the thing. This is the
thing for me too. This is the thing.
Yeah,
I've always been enamored with computers, so I was lucky. My parents bought me an Apple IIe when I was 7 years old.
Good Lord.
And sent me to a programming class in 1980, whatever. I have the certificate somewhere. I don't think I hung it back up, but I have the certificate from 1983 or whatever, 84, when a basic programming language, right? And I loved it, right? And then, in what I call junior high, which is now middle school,
sure,
I kind of got away from it. I got interested in girls, like most teenage boys do, and then came back to high school, and I was like, oh, I can take a computer class. I'm like, yeah, let's do that. And I took one of them, like, I want to take the advanced computer class. And they're like, well, your math grades really stink. I'm like, yeah, but computers and math, like, this is totally different. And they're like, no, it's not. Like in the 90s, right? And I'm like, they're like, all right, well, you get an A in the basic computer class, and you can take the Pascal. That was the advanced programming class. So I think I ended up getting A's in both. Not because I'm smart, because that's what I was interested in, right? Yeah. That's what it boils down to. Because I am like a mediocre programmer at best.
Yeah.
but I love I love doing it. I did it full time for a little while, and I was like, I don't want to be a full time programmer. So yeah, this is what I love to do.
Yeah, I get that too, where people will be like, "Oh, you're a hacker. You do a computer. You must be really good at math." And I was like, "No, I'm not."
Oh.
I once, Paul, I shit you not. About 2 or 3 years ago, I decided. So my dad, he's like blue collar dude, but was a math genius. So the contentiousness of math time homework in my house is something I still wake up in cold sweats about, because he, loving father. Awesome, but man, if I couldn't get a thing, it was screaming, and it was the whole, so I gave up. I gave up on math. So recently I tried to go back, because now, luckily, there are all sorts, there's Khan Academy, there's all these free resources that you can go. I get to about, it's not hyperbole, I'm not overreaching, 4th grade questions, and I start faltering. Say nothing.
Yeah, once you get into 4th and 5th grade math, because I try and help my kids with it.
No.
Sometimes I'm like, you'll never use that in the, and then I kind of like stop myself. I'm like, oh, God, that's terrible.
He just had one the other day. Mine's only in third now, where and just a different way that they do things, and like use patterns. And I was like, I'm out. Daddy's got to Google this later. Right. I can't do that. So what do you do? So you got soccer, you do that, right? Yeah. And you figured it out. And for anybody, by the way, we do upload this to Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So if you're not a visual person, you can't see right now. But behind Paul, in his office, he has some shelves. He has a bunch of Star Wars memorabilia. He's got what looks like lightsabers back there. There's some kind of Funko back there.
It's my Snoop Dogg Funko.
What?
Oh.
Yeah, my brother-in-law.
That's not what I expected.
He got me a Snoop Dogg Funko.
That's a good brother-in-law.
Like, how awesome is that? I love it. It's great.
What's your current? I'm just screwing around doing things. You do any hardware, like, or is it not computer related at all? Like, what are you doing to fill like your fun time?
Like, not computer at all. I have a lot of electric dirt bikes and e-bikes, and my kids ride them, so they constantly need to be fixed. I think, Brandon, you were saying, like, doing something hands-on. So I try and ride those and do the maintenance on those to kind of get out of the office. I love fishing. My dad, God rest his soul, took me fishing when I was 4 years old, and I was hooked ever since. And I take my kids fishing, so I'm a big largemouth bass fisherman, actually. So gets us in the outdoors, away from computers and electronics, which is nice. But I've got this renewed interest in all the hardware hacking things. So I've got like Raspberry Pis, like I'm trying to organize it all. My latest thing is I got this thing running. So this is a Hack RF, and I haven't done much with it yet. I'm at that point now where I need to find some projects to use it, but don't tell Garrett from Hacker Warehouse, because I love Garrett and I love Hacker Warehouse, and you should totally go buy the legitimate Hack RF. But if you wanted to go to AliExpress and buy one for $150 rather than $400 or $500, you can do that, like I did. And when you get it, make sure you load the SD card with all the things from the Mayhem firmware. Make sure you do that, because you'll get heinous errors like I did, and you'll think it's broken, but it's not, and it works completely fine. So,
Hacker Warehouse. But speaking of Hacker Warehouse, this year at DEF CON, they were in the vendor village, and of course, Dev's, every time I mention that I goon, Dev rides my ass about it. Like, oh, how many times did Danny mention he's a goon?
I'm not going to do it.
I'm not going to do it. I had to goon the line, because we had to separate. This is how big, if you've never checked out Hacker Warehouse, absolutely do that. But I had to separate the line from the rest of the vendor area and put them to where I was in the back of the thing and say, you're in the right line, but there's too many of you. Too many want to come, so we'd have to send them in shifts to go for exactly that thing. And also the what's the other little thing, the little orange thing that people are really into now?
Flippers.
The Flipper Zero.
Yeah, I've got a really cool Flipper Zero, actually, that the guy that printed these cases, I put a link to his, I don't know if it was Etsy or Tindy. I put a link to it, And now he's not making them anymore. He just gives you the step files so you can print it yourself. So I've got one of my Flipper Zeros in one of these like cool cases, and that's a Wi-Fi dev board on it that's running the Marauder firmware, which in terms of Wi-Fi hacking it's like okay-ish in a pinch kind of thing. But yeah, the Flipper actually was the thing that was a catalyst to like renew my like RF and hardware hacking things that I had put aside, largely because I was doing a lot of software. Like I was the primary developer on our PPWorks project for over a year. So like in my spare time, I was like, I need to learn how to do this esoteric thing in Python or this thing in Python. So let me go learn that. So now that I don't do that anymore, I got a Flipper, and I was like, oh, this does all the like Wi-Fi things that you can do better with other devices. And so,
by the way, kudos to whatever camera you have it's zoomed right in on that thing.
Yeah, that's
nice.
I feel like I should hold up more stuff. That's an A6000 Sony camera. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I have one of, what is this? I don't know the model, but it's the same. I use one of like the DSLR Sony things that one of my previous employers that I did a podcast for bought for me, and like never asked for back. So I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So much of my stuff was financed by former employers.
Yeah, and so we are building out the research team. So my day job is I work for Eclipsium. So we do firmware and supply chain security, and we have a research team that is absolutely amazing. My coworkers are amazing, and if you see me posting something smart about like hardware hacking or something, it's either Larry or my coworkers that like I can cheat. I is totally cheating. If I have a question, I can go ask someone who's been doing it for a really long time, right? I don't know where I was going with that. So, because I've got so many things that I'm working on. Oh, so we did a blog post about like how to build out your like security research lab. And so I started acquiring the things that I was missing. Like I did an inventory and I realized I was missing things to do some of this like hardware reverse engineering kind of stuff that we do a lot of at Eclipsium. And Larry does a lot for his job and has in the past, but you know, I want to do more of. And so I bought a lot of the things in the lab. And now we're doing a webcast, like a Halloween webcast that'll be announced next week for Eclipsium. And it's basically practically here's how you acquire the things that I've had to acquire to build like a basic hardware reverse engineering lab. And so actually research was published yesterday, which overlaps with what I'm working on that I haven't really talked about publicly, but like this is an Android TV device. So we've been working on analyzing these and looking at the pre-installed malware that comes on them, and looking at the hardware and soldering.
Pre-installed malware.
It is. So these things come with malware, dude. So it's not necessarily a new thing.
Sure. There's
been like several rounds of it, but like somewhere in the supply chain for these devices, someone's putting malware inside the Android operating system that lives on these devices.
No shit.
And
I mean, I'm surprised, but I'm not surprised. Like,
yeah, right. Like, and they all come from China. Like the one I was looking at earlier goes to Google.cn and does stuff like that. Like that's wonky.
That's not supposed to be like that.
Yeah. TLDR, don't get these Android TV boxes unless you're going to tear it apart and customize. This one, the one that I held up, this one's kind of cool. This is an X88 Pro 10 device, and I forget if this is AM Logic or something else, but it has an SD card slot reader on it. And someone figured out that you can boot it on the SD card and then install Linux on it. So there's a distribution called Armbian that will actually go on this device. So I think once this little project concludes, I'm going to put Linux on it just because I can. I have it as a Linux box.
Yeah, because you can, which is why we do anything when we're hacking anything, because it's possible, because we can. So Paul, we're getting towards the end here, and I'm thankful for the time you've given us. I'm again remain such a fan, have such a great amount of respect for you. But at the end of our shows, we've instituted. Matt in chat goes, "Can it run Doom though?" Probably. Yes. And we get. Probably. God, I'm so disappointed. I'm so disappointed that the Orb in Vegas has yet to run Doom. I
know, right?
Even as like a promotional, like they did it themselves, like they should at least put Doom on it. we always do this thing at the end, and I'm going to start with Brandon. I'll give you half a beat to think about it. We look back on our week. We always like to end the week on a positive note. Hopefully you had something positive happen in your week. If you had a highlight of your week, we'd like to hear about it. But Brandon, let's start with you and give our guest time to consider it. How was your week, Brandon? Anything good happen to you this week?
Yeah, it was. So finally, last week was just busy as like all get out, trying to wrap up work and do the webcast that we did together last week.
Very well received. Brandon did his first webcast for us. I was very happy with him, very proud of him.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I was so pleased about that. And so today was, or this week was a little bit more of a down week. So I was able to, I was just telling Danny, I've got a blog post that's ready to go live for the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. That
Feed our content machine, Brandon.
Yes, sir. So that's ready to go. And just making some headway on our cloud assessment for kind of revamping a little bit that we're doing with our Azure AD and Intra ID stuff. So just feeling good about the work that's going on right now. And the sun just came out, so I'm happy about that. What I'm not happy about, though, is that I've got a couple Android TVs that I have to go unplug after this. So
yeah.
And Brandon's like, well, speaking of which, I have some work to go do.
I can give you some tips after the show to check those out.
By the way, I didn't warn you beforehand, but we do our closing, and then we'll have a little chat after we're done streaming. So let's stick around for a couple minutes if you could, please. Sure. My week, honestly, no bullshit, not kissing ass. It's going to talk to you, Paul. I mean, you and I have talked before. We've met at Shmoo a couple of times and got a chance, but it is. I never take for granted when I get to do amazing, awesome things like this, because I get to do what I love to do. Like we had talked about, I'm going to do it here. I could do this working in healthcare or something, but I do it here because of the people that have formed who I am, both as a person and as a professional. And Paul has his face like, don't fucking blame me for that. I didn't do that shit. You listened to me. I didn't make you listen to us. But how formed my curiosity. I had it, but it was latent. And it was people like Allison's and Larry's and Paul's on Paul.com that brought that out, that like it was actually a thing. Now, one of my favorite little things that I always do, that I always heard other people do, and I didn't understand it, but now I do. Like whenever I walk into a place, I am looking and saying, oh, look, there's a security camera. What's this thing do? Why does that do that? I want to figure that out. That shows like Paul.com and Enterprise Security Weekly and Paul's Security Weekly have brought that out. So my highlight is just getting to shoot the shit with you for an hour. So that's my week. But now let's go to you. Did you have a particularly good week? Did you have, even if you had a bad week and you just want to vent about it, anything happened this week?
So I don't solder a lot of things. Like I've had soldering irons and I do it if I have to. And it's always like been on my list of like people give me the kits and like I never get around to soldering them together. And so this week I soldered a pin header on a board and I didn't fry the board, and it was better than the last time I tried to solder a pin header on, so that made me happy.
It's amazing. Like because we had talked about it briefly too. Hacker boxes, right? Hackerboxes.com.
Oh, I'm totally gonna do that, dude. Yeah.
And when you finally like get it, and one of my other buddies, last person, he sent me a very nice soldering gun, and he's also sent me like a really great. It's like an octopus. It has like 8 clips on it, and then it has a mag.
Yes.
And when I finally recognized, like, oh, that's how I do that thing. It recharges all of the rage you felt for the past 3 hours because you couldn't do the goddamn thing. But no, that's awesome, man. So, dude, Paul, again, stick around for a couple more minutes after we get off of here. For everybody else, whether you listened live or you're now re-listening back, I looked at some of our numbers on Spotify, shocked the hell out of me. Like, a lot of people do listen to the podcast, and we thank you for that. This is going to be up very shortly. I'm going to make sure to get this one up right away. But for all of our other stuff, because if you are listening on Apple or Spotify or Google Podcasts, you can't see the URLs we have up. We've got research, we've got blogs, we've got a whole bunch of content. It is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It is hub.trimarcsecurity.com. As always, you can follow us and all of the conferences that we're sponsoring, including Wild West Hacking Fest, Deadwood, South Dakota, next week starting on Wednesday for pre-training, and then the con is Thursday and Friday. You can find out about all of that, all of our assessments for Azure AD, Active Directory and VMware. We do all of that stuff at trimarcsecurity.com. And you might want to wander over to trimarcvision.com. I don't know, just a thought. Might be a product launch coming. There's definitely a product launch coming in January. So check all that out. We thank you. Thank you again, Paul. Thank you, Brandon, my esteemed host as always. And we will see everybody next week. And I'm going to take us out. We did Yacht Rock, and now we're going to do some EDM. Blaster Jacks and Timmy Trumpet are two of my favorites. We're going to do that. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Oh, wait, no, wait. Yeah, there's really not a hot mic opportunity right now. It's usually hot mics because Dev won't shut up.
I can hot mic for you real quick because you forgot to mention how we stream live on YouTube too, which you just found out about by accident 2 weeks ago.
I forgot I set it up. I forgot I set up YouTube to stream live at the same time that we do this. So there's a whole bunch of unedited episodes on YouTube right now.
Yeah. So if you're one of the 3 people that are watching on YouTube right now, sorry about that.
We try. I forgot. Nobody engages them. And I've failed. All right, Paul, I've learned nothing from listening to you, apparently.